Pandemic, contagion, plague, whatever you call it, these rare occurrences have gone down in the history books for different reasons. The coronavirus will certainly be remembered for the lives it took, but for bringing the world economy to a grinding halt. Here to give us perspective on the history of plagues is Dr. Jacob Steere-Williams, Associate Professor for the Department of History at the College of Charleston. And it's good to see you.
Thank you. You too.
And I trust that you've been staying healthy during this time.
We've been locked in quarantine, having some good family time. Thank you.
Good. And quarantine, that's going to come up later on in our discussion because quarantine is not a new thing that was used in other plagues to prevent the spread of disease. But let's first talk about how many plagues there have been in modern recorded history. According to my research, I read that there were 3 big ones. Can you give some clarification on that?
Yeah, sure. So if we're speaking just about bubonic plague, there have been 3 major global pandemics of bubonic plague in recorded human history. The second one is the one that most people are aware of, the medieval Black Death, right? That started in the 14th century, that swept off in a few short years, somewhere between, historians note, a third and a half of the population of Europe alone. That actually continued in pandemic waves, striking across the globe until the 18th century. And then plague cooled off until the late 19th century when, erupting out of China, something called, what scholars call the third plague pandemic, started in the 1890s and lasted until the mid-20th century.
Yeah, let's define what a plague is. We've been calling the coronavirus COVID-19 a pandemic. Is our pandemic similar to a plague of the past? What defines a plague?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's one I think that, there's a lot of scientific terms about disease that get thrown around a lot. And it is important to provide some perspective there. So, plague is a kind of general term that's been around for very long periods of human history for an epidemic, usually an infectious disease that erupts. When we use the word pandemic, what we're referring to, like the COVID-19 pandemic today, an epidemic disease that spreads from continent to continent. And what's interesting, I think, from both a historical and a scientific perspective, is the way in which different pandemics, due to their epidemiology and their causative organism, can start and spread very differently. So what we're dealing with today with COVID, of course, is a respiratory viral disease. But the bubonic plague that we talked about earlier was a bacterial disease that depends upon a rat vector and a flea vector. So it very much depends on what is the organism that we're talking about and how does it spread in a population.
It just sounds like everything kind of goes back to rodents. Would you say that these are typically the species from which these illnesses, these diseases come from?
Yeah, so scientists and historical epidemiologists have shown that the vast majority of infectious diseases at some point in human history came from very close human-animal contact, which is, I think, a really interesting perspective for thinking about, what happened recently with the origin of the novel coronavirus.
Is that something where you'd have to be bitten or ingest an infected animal?
Right, so it depends. Sometimes it's just close contact. When you have wild populations of animals that have their own ecosystems in the natural world and then come into contact with humans, maybe for the first time, or with domesticated animals, that's often what we see. And I think most folks are aware of some of the more recent examples in the last 10 or 15 or 20 years of H1N1, H5N1, SARS. There's been other examples of mutations of viruses, not unlike the novel coronavirus that causes COVID-19 today, that have been the origin of a pandemic.
Okay, now give us some perspective here, because we're talking about the bubonic plague that wiped out 30 to 50 million people. Compare that to today's COVID-19.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think to put this into perspective, especially for a city like Charleston, is really interesting to do. So Charleston is a kind of city for a historian of epidemics like myself. It's a city full of enigmas. So at once, today we all sort of recognize that Charleston is this lovely tourist destination. I actually had to go to my office at the College of Charleston yesterday, and I saw more people than I thought I would see just out and about enjoying the city. And yet, as a historian, what I know is that Charleston from the 17th century was a city that was known for being pestilential, for being diseased. And so, there were outbreaks of yellow fever, which was a disease endemic to tropical West Africa in the 18th and in the early 19th century, just waves of this very devastating disease. Smallpox, likewise, in the 18th and 19th century, cholera in the 19th century. So Charleston has been a city that has been thought about as a diseased city, as a dangerous city, as this big, important port city of the Atlantic world.
Oh, that's so fascinating. Oh, well, we do need to take a break, but when we come back, you've got a new book coming out. You're also working on your second book. I want to get to that fascinating stuff, Doctor. We'll be back in 2 minutes. We've been chatting with Dr. Jacob Steere-Williams. He's Associate Professor for the Department of History at the College of Charleston. He's got a book coming out in November. It's called The Filth Disease. Tell us more about this.
Yeah, thanks. So I spent about a decade researching and writing this book, which led me to archives in England, in South Africa, and in India and Australia. In this book, The Filth Disease, it refers to typhoid fever, which is a disease that in the Western world, it's a food and waterborne disease. We don't have much of a threat of anymore, but throughout the world is still one of the major infectious diseases. And in this book, I used this research on typhoid to talk about the emergence of global epidemiology. So doctors who for the first time were being employed by governments to go down and track the spread of epidemics, not unlike what we're seeing today. So this global impetus, the Anthony Fauci's of today, had their origins in the mid-19th century.
So fascinating. Okay, so you're coming out with that book. You're also in the midst of writing another one. We've been talking about the COVID-19, the coronavirus, how this relates, how it's similar or dissimilar to plagues of the past, what a plague is. You are also working on another book. Can you give us the title of that one?
Yeah, sure. So my working title for my current project is called Carbolic Colonialism. And that project is about what we talked about earlier, the third plague pandemic, which erupted in the late 19th and spread into the early 20th century. And that global pandemic is one that not very many people know about. And I think largely that's because in the U.S. it didn't affect the American people very much. There was one outbreak in San Francisco where it was a explosion of bubonic plague and several hundred people died. And it was located in San Francisco's Chinatown. And what's interesting about that case study of San Francisco is that the Chinese American immigrants who were living there were blamed for the spread of that disease of bubonic plague. And there was this eruption of anti-Chinese xenophobia that erupted all throughout the U.S. And so when
history has repeated itself. We experienced some of that earlier this year. Mm-hmm.
That's right. And so in this book, I look at these examples from across the world in the 19th century, in the late 19th and early 20th century of India and South Africa, where the third plague pandemic killed somewhere between 12 and 15 million people.
It's incredible. So with the way we've been able to stem the coronavirus, that we've taken into precautions, things that have been used in the past, because another question I have for you is, how did humanity survive with the way these diseases spread from continent to continent? It's amazing that we're still here when you think about how very deadly and how primitive medicine was in those days. In fact, some of the imagery from previous plagues of doctors dressed in these very disturbing looking masks that have a beak on them. I mean, the way the doctors looked is almost more frightening than the disease itself. So what did people do to protect themselves then, and have we been implementing the same things today?
Yeah, I think, by the time we get to the late 19th, early 20th century, I think there's three important ways in which we can see some parallels. So one is that by the early 20th century, there was a recognition of the germ theory. So at least for infectious diseases caused by bacteria, there was microscopic knowledge of what these diseases were caused by. And there was the emergence of this whole industry, this chemical industry of disinfectants. That's kind of a cue on my title, Carbolic Colonialism, refers to carbolic acid. It was the first great disinfectant of the world in the early 20th century. And so that's one, is the use of chemicals to try to destroy bacteria, both used by governments and used in households.
And those came with their own set of issues as well. Finally, last question, just a few seconds left. Have we learned anything from this pandemic? Are you surprised that we are experiencing a pandemic today?
No, I'm not surprised. One of the last things I always tell undergraduate students at the College of Charleston that I didn't have to tell them this year, this spring, is that we should be expecting the next pandemic. I mean, history shows that it's one of the essential parts of humanity. Of the human condition is experiencing pandemics. And so I think one of the things that we can learn about COVID, if we put it into historical context, is that pandemics, we should expect them, but they also are a global phenomenon. So there's so much that we talk about of our local communities, but we really need to keep in mind that these are global phenomenon that need global solutions.
And keep clean. Wash your hands. Always wash your hands. Dr. Jacob, thank you so much. This has been so much fun to talk to you.
Thank you.
We're back after this.